No one in the small mountain town could have imagined that a peaceful weekend hike would turn into the most harrowing survival story they had ever heard. The hiker, a quiet and reserved man named Ethan Hayes, had always found refuge in the solitude of nature. The mountains were his escape, a place where he could silence the noise of the world and feel grounded again. But on that one fateful afternoon, as the sky darkened with an unexpected storm rolling over the ridges, Ethan's deep connection with nature was tested in ways he never believed possible. While navigating a narrow cliffside trail, the soil beneath him gave way, sending him tumbling violently into the dense forest below. He plummeted more than 40 feet before crashing into a moss-covered slope. When he finally regained consciousness, drenched, bruised, and in agonizing pain, he realized he was stranded miles away from help, with no food, no phone signal, and no clear path back. What followed would become a fight, not only for survival, but for hope. The air was heavy and cold. Ethan's lungs burned as he tried to drag himself upright, discovering quickly that his ankle was severely sprained and his backpack had been ripped away during the fall. Panic threatened to take over, but he forced himself to breathe slowly, to stay rational. Around him, the forest was silent except for the distant dripping of stormwater falling from pine branches. Even in the stillness, he felt an unspoken warning. He was alone, injured, and dangerously vulnerable. But in that terrifying moment, something within him refused to surrender. As he examined his surroundings, disoriented but determined, he spotted something unexpected: clusters of mushrooms growing wildly across the damp forest floor. They were not the kind of food he ever imagined relying on, but with no supplies and the clock ticking against him, Ethan knew he would have to trust the wilderness in ways he never had before. These mushrooms, raw and earthy, would become the thin line between life and death. Hours passed as Ethan fought through the pain and exhaustion, trying to piece together what direction he had fallen from. Every attempt to stand brought a wave of agony through his leg that nearly forced him back to the ground. But he refused to lie down and wait for fate. The forest was vast, and rain clouds swallowed the light, creating an unsettling sense of timelessness. Hunger gnawed at him painfully, but he dared not wander far. The fear of getting even more lost, or stumbling into danger, kept him rooted near the place he had fallen. The mushrooms he had found were small and bitter, but they were the only source of energy he had. Each bite felt like an act of desperation, a choice made not out of desire, but necessity. He prayed they were safe. He prayed he would live long enough to be found. By nightfall, the temperature plummeted, and the forest transformed into a labyrinth of shadows. Ethan wrapped himself in leaves, branches, and whatever he could gather to keep warm. His body trembled uncontrollably, not only from the cold, but from the fear of the unknown. Wild animals, worsening injury, or the possibility of never seeing daylight again. Yet through the fear, he found moments of clarity. He remembered stories of survivors who persisted with only their will to live, who leaned on faith and instinct when everything else was stripped away. As the wind howled above him, he whispered a prayer, asking God for strength, for warmth, for a miracle. The mushrooms sustained him just enough to keep his mind alert, and in that strange, fragile space between fear and faith, he made a promise to himself. No matter what the night brought, he would not give up. Morning brought a thin veil of light through the treetops, and with it a renewed sense of determination. Ethan knew he needed to move, even if only by inches. He fashioned a crude walking stick from a fallen branch and began dragging himself through the forest. Every step felt like fire in his ankle, but he pushed on. The mushrooms were still the only food available, and he ate them reluctantly, each meal reminding him of just how fragile his situation truly was. His mind oscillated between hope and despair, faith and doubt, but he kept going, trusting that every painful movement, every uncomfortable bite of raw fungus was bringing him closer to survival. And though he didn't yet know it, his story of cliffs, storms, mushrooms, and sheer willpower was about to change not just his life, but the lives of everyone who would one day hear it. Before diving into Ethan Hayes' extraordinary journey, a story of survival, faith, and the delicate balance between fear and hope, make sure to subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from. Your support helps us continue bringing powerful and inspiring stories like this one. Now let us walk through the chilling and unforgettable experience that transformed an ordinary hiker into a living testimony of resilience and divine providence. Ethan had always been drawn to the mountains. To many, they were just a scenic backdrop. But to him, they were a sanctuary. After years of working a stressful job and dealing with the emotional weight of life's uncertainties, he often found solace in the quiet of the wilderness. It was a place where he could breathe, reflect, and reconnect with the world in a meaningful way. He never imagined that the same mountains that brought him peace would soon push him into the greatest battle of his life. The hike had started off normally, crisp air, soft trails, and the comforting sound of wind running through the pines. Ethan brought only minimal gear, planning to return home by the late afternoon. But nature had different plans. A sudden storm swept across the mountains, turning the once stable trail into a slippery danger zone. Despite his experience, Ethan found himself at the mercy of the elements. One misstep, one unstable patch of ground, and gravity took over. His fall changed everything. Lying at the bottom of the cliff, Ethan was confronted with the brutal truth. He was utterly alone. The storm had washed away his footprints, and the dense forest canopy blocked any sign of his location from above. His phone was useless without signal, and his backpack, his only source of supplies, had vanished during the fall. Survival was no longer a hypothetical scenario. It was the only thing that mattered. The forest would not feed him. The cold would not spare him. His injuries would not heal on their own. He had to fight. Yet, amid the fear and uncertainty, Ethan found strength in a place he least expected: his faith. Each moment of struggle pushed him closer to a deeper understanding of resilience and divine guidance. Every mushroom he ate, every painful step he took, every prayer whispered into the empty forest became a part of the story that would one day inspire thousands. His survival was not just physical, it was spiritual. And as his journey unfolded, he discovered that miracles sometimes appear in the most unlikely forms. The moment Ethan Hayes tumbled over the crumbling edge of the cliff, time seemed to stretch into an eternity. His body twisted violently as he fell, branches slashing against his arms and rocks scraping his skin. The world blurred into a dizzying swirl of earth and sky until, with a bone-shaking thud, he slammed into a slope, thick with wet moss. Pain exploded through his leg, radiating upward like fire. For several minutes he couldn't move or think clearly. All he felt was the crushing weight of the impact and the terrifying realization that no one knew where he was. When he finally managed to lift his head, the forest around him spun. He blinked, trying to force the dizziness away. His ankle throbbed with an intensity that made him grit his teeth. The sprain was severe, possibly even fractured, and every attempted movement sent new waves of torment through his body. He reached instinctively for his backpack, but his hand closed around nothing but leaves and mud. The pack must have been torn off during the fall, swallowed somewhere by the wilderness. He called out, hoping for an echo, a sign, anything, but only silence answered him. Rain began to fall again, cold and steady, dripping from the dense canopy overhead. Ethan dragged himself toward a nearby boulder, using it to prop his back up. He tried to assess his surroundings, but everything felt unfamiliar and disorienting. The trail he had been on was nowhere in sight. Instead, he was surrounded by towering trunks of ancient pines, thick ferns, and a nearly impenetrable wall of undergrowth. Panic flickered inside him, but he forced himself to breathe slowly. Panic would get him killed. He needed clarity. He needed to think. He tried to stand. The moment he put weight on his right ankle, his vision blackened at the edges, and he collapsed back to the ground, gasping. His leg was useless, at least for now. He wiped rainwater from his forehead and scanned the forest floor for anything that could help him. That was when he noticed them. Clusters of mushrooms pushing through the damp earth, their pale caps stark against the dark soil. He didn't recognize the species, but he knew enough from survival shows to understand the risk. Mushrooms could sustain him, or poison him. But with his stomach already growling and his situation worsening by the minute, he could not afford to ignore them. Ethan hesitated, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. His father had always told him never to eat wild mushrooms unless he was absolutely certain they were safe. But here, lost in the depths of the forest with no supplies, certainty was a luxury he didn't have. He examined the mushrooms carefully, noting their texture, their smell, their shape. They resembled a common edible species he had seen in markets, though not perfectly. "God, please let this be the right decision," he whispered before taking a cautious bite. The taste was earthy and sharp, almost metallic, but it didn't burn or sting. He chewed slowly, waiting for any sign of sickness. None came. Hunger overcame fear, and he ate a few more. Strengthened slightly, Ethan forced himself to focus on his next move. Staying by the cliffside was dangerous. Fallen debris could still collapse, and predators often roamed near such areas. He needed to find a more sheltered spot. Using a broken branch as a crutch, he pushed himself upward and began hobbling deeper into the forest. Each movement was agony, but he clung to the hope that even a short distance might bring better protection. The ground was uneven and slippery, and several times he nearly fell again. But he pressed on, determined not to let despair win. Eventually, Ethan found a small semi-open area between two large cedar trees, their thick roots forming a natural wall behind him. The space was dry enough to sit without sinking into mud, and the trees would provide some shelter from the wind. He gathered fallen leaves, pine needles, and branches to form a crude insulation pile around him. It wasn't much, but it was something. As he worked, his body trembled from exhaustion and cold, and he realized just how vulnerable he truly was. Night would come soon, and with it, temperatures that could easily take his life. When darkness finally settled over the forest, Ethan felt swallowed by it. Every sound seemed amplified. Distant rustling, the snap of twigs, the low groan of trees shifting in the wind. He clutched his stick tightly, knowing it was hardly a weapon, but at least something to hold. The raw mushrooms he had eaten earlier sat oddly in his stomach, but they kept the hunger at bay. He prayed softly, asking God for protection through the night, for warmth, for strength. His breath was visible in the frigid air, and he curled into himself, shivering uncontrollably. The night felt endless. Dawn brought little warmth, but the faint light gave Ethan a renewed sense of direction. His body ached terribly, and his ankle was swollen to nearly twice its normal size. Still, he knew he had to move if he wanted any chance of survival. With deep breaths and clenched teeth, he forced himself upright and began dragging his injured leg along the forest floor. As he moved, he kept his eyes open for more mushrooms, collecting a few clusters into his shirt. They weren't ideal, but they were the only food source he had. Ethan didn't know it yet, but his fall was only the beginning of a much longer journey. One that would test not only his endurance, but his faith, his courage, and his ability to trust that even in the darkest places, God could carve a path to survival. He staggered forward, every step a battle, unaware that his story would one day become a testament to the strength of the human spirit. In the depths of the wilderness, surrounded by silence and uncertainty, Ethan Hayes began the first painful, humbling chapter of his fight to stay alive. Ethan Hayes pushed himself forward through the early morning haze, every step feeling like a negotiation between determination and agony. The forest floor, slick with dew and fallen needles, made the simple act of moving feel like crossing a battlefield. He gripped his makeshift walking stick tightly, his knuckles pale, and scanned the expanse ahead. The towering pines absorbed the sound of his movements, creating an unsettling silence around him. The lack of birdsong, the stillness of the air. It made the forest feel almost watchful, as though the wilderness itself was deciding whether it would be his foe or his unexpected ally. His ankle pulsed with a deep throbbing pain, each heartbeat sending another wave through his leg. Still, he pressed forward, knowing that staying in one place was a slow death. He needed a vantage point or a landmark, something that could help him orient himself. But the forest was uniform and repetitive, each tree blending into the next like a maze built by nature. After a while, Ethan stopped to rest beside a fallen log. He pulled one of the raw mushrooms from his shirt pocket and stared at it, wondering how something so small had become his lifeline. With a sigh, he put it into his mouth and chewed slowly. The bitter taste lingered on his tongue, reminding him once again of his desperation. Hours passed, and Ethan's progress was painfully slow. His injured foot dragged along the ground, creating a faint trail in the pine needles behind him. He hoped, perhaps irrationally, that someone might find it. He imagined rescuers following his meandering path through the forest, calling his name, searching for any sign of him. But as the day went on, the hope faded with the sunlight. The forest was simply too vast, too shadowed, too unforgiving. By afternoon, clouds began gathering once more, promising another bout of rain. Ethan felt dread rise in his chest. Another storm could spell disaster. The first raindrops fell like cold needles against his skin. Ethan searched frantically for shelter, dragging himself toward a cluster of boulders partially covered by thick overhanging branches. He squeezed into the narrow space beneath them, grateful for even the slightest protection. The rain intensified, drumming heavily against the rocks and earth. Ethan listened to the storm rage above him, grateful that he had found cover, but painfully aware of how exposed he still was. Water ran along the ground, pooling around his legs, chilling him to the bone. He curled his arms around himself, shaking from cold and exhaustion. As he huddled beneath the rocks, Ethan felt his mind drifting. Memories surfaced, his mother's voice calling him in for dinner, his father teaching him how to tie proper hiking knots, the laughter of friends around campfires. Each memory felt like a distant star, beautiful, unreachable, and painfully far away. A lump formed in his throat. He wanted to see home again. He wanted to feel warmth, to hear voices, to be held. He whispered a prayer into the darkness around him, not knowing if anyone or anything could hear him out here. God, please don't leave me here. Please show me the way. The storm eventually eased, leaving behind the suffocating smell of wet earth and pine bark. Ethan rose from his makeshift refuge, shivering uncontrollably. His clothes clung to him like icy rags, and his teeth chattered violently. Yet despite his weakened state, he forced himself onward. The daylight was fading, and the last thing he wanted was to navigate the forest in total darkness again. He moved slowly, leaning heavily on his walking stick, scanning the ground for more mushrooms. Finding a small patch near a fallen trunk, he collected a handful, though the very sight of them now filled him with dread. Evening approached, painting the forest in shades of amber and grey. Ethan knew he needed a place to rest, somewhere safe enough to survive the night. After several minutes of searching, he found a thick tree with roots large enough to form a hollow. It wasn't perfect, but it provided a sense of enclosure that comforted him more than he expected. Settling into the hollow, he pulled leaves over himself for insulation. His ankle throbbed relentlessly, and dehydration gnawed at him just as intensely as hunger. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind, wondering how many more nights he could endure. Darkness deepened, but sleep refused to come. Instead, Ethan found himself listening to the distant calls of animals, rustles in the bushes, the snap of a branch somewhere far off, the low hoot of an owl. Each sound made his heart pound. His mind raced with possibilities: wolves, bears, cougars. Though he knew such predators usually avoided humans, he also understood desperation. If an animal had gone long enough without food, anything could become prey. He tightened his grip on his walking stick and whispered another prayer, this one softer, more fragile. Lord, please protect me tonight. Hours passed in a tense blur, and Ethan drifted in and out of shallow, restless sleep. He dreamed of home, of warmth, of normalcy, only to jolt awake each time to the reality of the cold forest. His ankle stiffened during the night, and when dawn finally broke, he could barely move it. Waves of discouragement washed over him. How much longer can I last? He wondered aloud, his voice cracking. But then something stirred inside him. A spark of faith, a memory of his father's favorite saying, "Your darkest moments reveal your strongest prayers." Ethan clung to those words like a lifeline. As the morning sun filtered through the branches, Ethan sat up slowly, forcing his stiff limbs into motion. Today he would push harder. Today he would fight with whatever strength remained in him. The forest, silent and inscrutable, offered no promises. But Ethan Hayes had made one to himself. He would not surrender. Not today. Not in this place. Gathering his courage and the last of the mushrooms he had collected, he rose unsteadily to his feet and prepared to face another day of survival in the untamed wilderness. By the third day in the wilderness, Ethan Hayes felt the full weight of hunger settling into his body like a slow, relentless tide. His stomach cramped painfully, growling with a ferocity he had never experienced. While the mushrooms kept him from starvation, they lacked everything his body desperately needed. His muscles weakened, his mind fogged, and each step felt heavier than the last. Yet, as he dragged his injured leg across the uneven ground, he forced himself to focus on one truth. He was still alive. If he was alive, there was still hope. And if there was hope, then he could continue. His surroundings began to shift as he moved deeper into the forest. The tall pines seemed older here, towering like ancient guardians watching over him. Sunlight fought its way through the thick canopy, creating scattered beams of gold on the forest floor. For the first time since the fall, Ethan felt a faint warmth on his skin. He paused to bask in it, closing his eyes as the light touched his face. That brief moment of comfort reminded him of home. The warmth of morning coffee, the glow of lamps in his living room, the soft hum of his refrigerator. Simple things he'd always taken for granted. Now they felt like treasures from another lifetime. But the peace was short-lived. The deeper he walked, the more unpredictable the terrain became. Jagged roots jutted from the earth like hidden traps. Fallen logs blocked his path. Thorny bushes tore at his clothes and skin. Every obstacle reminded him that the forest was indifferent to his suffering. It wasn't cruel, just wild. Ethan stumbled twice, nearly collapsing under his own weight, but each time he planted his stick firmly in the ground and forced himself upright again. His breath grew ragged, but his spirit refused to break. He searched constantly for mushrooms, scanning the base of trees, the shadows near rocks, and the soft soil where moisture collected. Sometimes he found only one or two. Other times he found none at all. His stomach twisted with disappointment each time he came up empty-handed. Once, he even considered eating the bark from a tree because the hunger had grown so overwhelming. But he knew better. The mushrooms, as unpleasant as they were still his safest option. With a resigned sigh, he kept moving, whispering prayers under his breath. "Lord, just guide me to enough for today. Just enough to keep going." By midday, Ethan reached a small clearing, a circular patch of sunlight surrounded by dense shrubs. At the center was a rotting tree stump covered in clusters of mushrooms. Relief washed over him so intensely that he nearly cried. He knelt beside the stump, carefully plucking a handful of the raw caps, thanking God for the provision. He ate slowly, savoring each bitter bite, knowing it was fuel his body desperately needed. Even though the taste made his stomach lurch, he forced the mushrooms down. When he finished, he leaned back against the stump and let out a trembling sigh. The forest, for once, had given him something he needed. But the moment of calm was interrupted by a sudden noise, a soft rustle in the bushes to his right. Ethan froze. His heart hammered in his chest as he strained to listen. The rustle came again, louder this time, followed by a low, almost questioning grunt. Ethan's breath caught. He couldn't see the creature, but he knew it was close, dangerously close. His ankle throbbed and his muscles tensed. Running was impossible. Fighting was hopeless. All he could do was stay still. After what felt like an eternity, the rustling faded, moving slowly back into the underbrush. Whatever it was, deer, boar, or something worse, had changed its mind. Ethan exhaled shakily, gratitude flooding him. "Thank you. Thank you," he whispered. The encounter reminded him just how fragile his situation was. The forest was full of life, not all of it friendly. He resumed his journey with heightened caution, listening carefully to every sound. The sunlight gradually dimmed as thick clouds rolled across the sky once again. Ethan prayed silently that another storm wasn't approaching. His body couldn't withstand another freezing night in the rain. He needed shelter, something sturdier than tree roots or rocks. A cave, an overhang, anything that could shield him from the weather. But as he limped forward, the forest offered only more trees and shadows. Hours passed, and Ethan felt himself slipping into despair. The pain in his leg grew unbearable, and dehydration left his lips cracked and his throat thick. His stick wobbled beneath him, and he stumbled forward, barely catching himself. For a moment, he considered lying down, closing his eyes, and letting exhaustion sweep him away. But then he remembered his mother's face, the way she smiled, the way she prayed for him every night. He imagined her waiting, not knowing where he was, hoping he'd come home. And that thought alone was enough to push him one step further. Finally, as the sun began to set, Ethan's perseverance was rewarded. He spotted a small indentation in the side of a rocky hill, a shallow cave, its entrance partially hidden behind ferns. With renewed hope, he dragged himself toward it. The interior was dark but dry, with enough space for him to lie down comfortably. Exhaustion nearly overwhelmed him as he settled inside. For the first time since the fall, he had a real shelter. Not perfect, but a refuge. He whispered another prayer, this one filled with gratitude, and allowed his battered body to rest. Night settled over the forest as Ethan lay curled inside the cave, listening to the faint howling of wind outside. He knew tomorrow would bring more challenges, more hunger, more pain, more uncertainty. But for now he was safe. For now he had survived another day. And as his eyes closed, he felt a small but powerful spark within him. Hope. A fragile hope, but one that grew each time he chose to keep moving, each time he whispered a prayer, each time he refused to surrender. In that dark cave, Ethan Hayes drifted into sleep, unaware that the wilderness had far more in store for him. Trials that would push him deeper into faith, into courage, and into the raw truth of what it means to fight for life. When Ethan Hayes awoke the next morning inside the small cave, his mouth felt like sandpaper. Hunger had become familiar, but thirst was a new and far more dangerous enemy. His tongue clung to the roof of his mouth, and each swallow felt like dragging gravel down his throat. For a moment, he lay still, listening to the heartbeat pounding loudly in his ears. He knew that without water, his strength would collapse long before his will did. Summoning what little energy remained in him, he sat up slowly and leaned on the cave wall, fighting off the dizziness that threatened to consume him. The forest outside was wrapped in a cold, pale light. Mist clung to the ground like a ghostly blanket, swirling around Ethan's feet as he limped out of the cave. He gripped his walking stick firmly and forced himself forward, aware that every step mattered now more than ever. The mushrooms he had eaten the day before sat heavily in his stomach, but without water, even food could become his enemy. Ethan scanned the terrain, looking for any clues, a change in vegetation, a dip in the ground, the faint sound of trickling, anything that might hint at a stream. Hours passed, and the forest remained stubbornly silent. No streams, no puddles, not even damp soil he could wring moisture from. Ethan's vision began to blur at the edges, and he stumbled more frequently, catching himself against trees. His body was weakening rapidly, but every time he felt the pull of despair, he whispered to himself, "Keep going, just a little farther." He remembered stories from survival guides, recalling that animals often followed predictable paths to water. If he could find tracks, He might find hope. So he slowed his pace, scanning the ground with renewed focus. Finally, near a patch of muddy earth, Ethan spotted something. Fresh tracks. Not human, not large. Likely a deer or similar animal. The prints led in a loose line through the underbrush, and Ethan felt a surge of excitement that cut through his exhaustion. Animals needed water as desperately as he did. If he followed the tracks, he might find what he was praying for. He adjusted his grip on the stick and limped after them, pushing aside branches and forcing himself through briars. Every breath felt heavy, every movement a battle. The tracks continued for several hundred yards before dipping gently into a shallow decline. The vegetation here looked different, greener, fuller, more vibrant. Ethan's heart began to race with fragile hope. He quickened his pace, ignoring the screaming protest from his ankle. Then, through the trees he saw it, a small ravine, its floor dark and damp. His pulse surged. He stumbled toward it, nearly falling to his knees as he spotted the glimmer of moisture along the rock bed. It wasn't a flowing creek, but it was something. A faint trickle wept from between two stones, forming a tiny pool no larger than his cupped palm. Ethan dropped to the ground, trembling. He pressed his hands into the muddy soil, letting the coolness seep into his skin. Then he lowered his face toward the little pool, sipping carefully. The water tasted like earth and minerals, but to Ethan it felt like heaven touching his lips. He drank until his stomach tightened, then pulled back, gasping for air. Tears filled his eyes, a raw, overwhelming gratitude that tightened his chest. He whispered, "Thank you, God," his voice cracking in the quiet ravine. Strength slowly began to seep back into his body. After drinking, Ethan remained beside the ravine, gathering what little water the rocks released. He cupped his hands, drinking slowly, savoring each drop. He knew he couldn't stay here forever, but for the first time since the fall, he felt a sense of control, however small, over his situation. Resting against the ravine wall, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The forest around him rustled softly, and the faint light through the canopy painted the world in shades of green and gold. For the first time in days, he didn't feel like the forest was swallowing him. Instead, it felt almost merciful. But as he sat there, regaining strength, a new concern crept into his mind. His ankle was worsening. Swollen, discolored, and increasingly stiff, it made movement more difficult with each passing hour. He knew that if he didn't find help soon, infection, or simple immobility, could put his life in even greater danger. The cave he had slept in offered safety, but not the rescue he needed. He studied his surroundings carefully. The ravine sloped gently downward, and water often carved paths through land over time. If he followed the direction of the trickle, it might lead to a larger source, or even out of the deepest parts of the wilderness. With renewed determination, Ethan filled his shirt with several mushrooms he found growing near the ravine wall. They would keep him alive for the next stretch of travel, though he dreaded the taste. He took one last drink from the tiny pool, then pulled himself to his feet using his walking stick. His trembling legs protested, but he steadied himself. The decision was clear. He would follow the direction of the water's path. Water meant life, and where there was water, there was a chance, however small, of finding civilization again. He took his first step forward, wincing as pain shot through his ankle. The forest ahead looked vast and uncertain, filled with shadows and untold dangers. But Ethan Hayes no longer felt as powerless as he had the day before. He had shelter. He had water. He had faith. And faith, he realized, was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. With his stick planted firmly in the dirt and his heart quietly praying for strength, he limped down the ravine's edge, stepping into the next unknown chapter of his fight for survival. The morning sun climbed slowly as Ethan Hayes followed the narrow footpath that hugged the old wooden fence. Each step sent a dull throb up his splintered leg, but he moved with a momentum that felt almost foreign after days of disorientation. The world around him had shifted. The forest that once caged him now felt like a corridor guiding him forward. He paused occasionally, listening for any unnatural sound. The purr of an engine, the distant hum of voices, but the woods remained stubbornly silent. Still, there was an undeniable difference in the air, as if the forest itself acknowledged his progress. Ethan gripped his walking stick and pushed on, determined not to let the fragile spark of hope flicker out. Hours passed slowly, marked by the rhythm of his uneven steps and the rustling of branches overhead. His hunger gnawed at him, reminding him that mushrooms alone could not sustain him forever. His muscles trembled with fatigue, and the bandage on his ankle grew damp with sweat, loosening slightly. Even so, Ethan refused to stop. He traced the fence line like it was a lifeline itself, a human-made structure in a wilderness that had nearly swallowed him whole. He thought of Olivia again, her voice, her steady presence, the way she had always believed he could endure anything. He let that belief become fuel. One more step, he muttered. Then another, and another. Survival had become a conversation he had with himself every few seconds. Around midday, he reached a break in the fence where a small wooden sign, half rotted and nearly devoured by moss, leaned crookedly. He brushed the growth away and found faint carved letters. He squinted, unsure if the words were simply old or if his vision blurred from exhaustion. But soon, the message revealed itself. Trail, 0.7 miles. Ethan's breath caught. He traced the engraved letters with trembling fingers, as though physical touch would confirm reality. A maintained trail meant foot traffic, and foot traffic meant people, hikers, wardens, anybody. The promise of human presence ignited something in him that felt dangerously close to relief. He turned toward the direction of the arrow and whispered, "Thank God." Then he began his slow descent along the indicated path. The terrain became more manageable, though still dotted with rocks and dips that tested his injured ankle. Ethan took great care to maintain his balance, fully aware that another fall could be the end. The forest canopy opened in places, letting sunlight wash over him and warm his aching body. He stopped at a fallen log to catch his breath and noticed small wild berries growing nearby. Uncertain whether they were safe to eat, he resisted the temptation. He had been lucky with mushrooms, luck he could not rely on twice. Instead, he took another sip of water from the stream-held pouch in his shirt. He whispered a quiet prayer, not out of ritual, but out of a growing recognition that something, or someone, had carried him this far. A faint sound broke through the stillness. Ethan froze. He tilted his head, straining to hear. At first he thought it was the wind shifting branches, but then it returned. A distant rhythmic clacking. His heart pounded. It almost sounded like walking sticks tapping against stone or trekking poles. He wasn't dreaming. The pattern was unmistakable. He leaned heavily on his own stick and called out with all the strength he could muster. "Hello, please." "Over here." His voice cracked, rough from dehydration and days without speaking loudly. The sound echoed through the trees, uncertain as to whether it carried far enough. He waited, breath held, hope trembling inside him. For a moment, nothing happened. The forest held its tight, suffocating silence. Panic crawled up Ethan's spine. Had he imagined the sound? Had exhaustion made him hear what he wanted to hear? But then suddenly, the tapping stopped, and a new sound followed. Voices. Real voices. Human voices. Ethan's legs nearly buckled as relief hit him in a sudden, overwhelming wave. He shouted again, louder, desperate, "I'm here, please, I need help." The voices grew clearer, now marked by urgency. Branches snapped and footsteps hurried toward him. Ethan's chest tightened with emotion. Days of fear and isolation collapsed within him, replaced by a trembling disbelief. He was no longer alone. Two hikers appeared through the brush, a man and a woman, both wearing backpacks and carrying trekking poles. Their expressions shifted instantly from confusion to shock as they took in Ethan's injured appearance. Dirt plastered his skin, his clothes torn and discolored, his face gaunt and hollow. The woman knelt beside him, eyes wide. "Oh my God, sir, are you okay?" Ethan tried to answer, but the weight of the moment clogged his throat. The man pulled out a water bottle and offered it to him while already reaching for a satellite phone strapped to his shoulder. "It's all right," the hiker said gently. "You're safe now. We've got you." Ethan closed his eyes, unable to stop the tears from slipping down his cheeks. The hikers moved quickly and efficiently. The woman inspected his splintered ankle and let out a low gasp. "You did this yourself?" she asked. Ethan nodded faintly. "Had to." His voice cracked. She squeezed his shoulder with quiet admiration. The man stepped aside to make the emergency call, relaying location coordinates and Ethan's condition with a calm urgency. Hearing the words, "injured hiker found," felt surreal to Ethan, as though the suffering he had endured had happened to someone else. Within minutes, the hikers laid out a reflective blanket and helped ease him onto it. They offered food carefully, mindful of how starved he likely was. Every bite, every sip, felt like stepping out of a nightmare and into the first light of dawn. Before long, distant helicopter rotors began to thrum through the treetops. Ethan looked up, watching as the sound grew louder and closer, his heart swelling with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. The hikers signaled the rescue team with bright fabric, waving it above the clearing. As the helicopter descended and rescue personnel approached, Ethan felt the final thread of fear unwind. He had survived the fall, the hunger, the loneliness, the cold, and the forest itself. He had fought when everything inside him screamed to surrender. And somehow, through equal parts, instinct, faith, and raw determination, he was being carried out of the wilderness alive. When the rescuers lifted him into the helicopter, Ethan stared at the canopy below. The same canopy that had nearly become his grave, yet had also sheltered him, fed him, and guided him to safety. Tears slid down his cheeks as he whispered, "Thank you, thank you." As the helicopter rose, the forest shrank beneath him, but the lessons carved into him remained vast. Survival had demanded everything from him, his strength, his will, his humility, and his reliance on something greater than himself. Ethan Hayes closed his eyes and let the wind wash over him, knowing that life, fragile and fierce, had been given back to him. And he would never forget the cost of that gift. In the days that followed Ethan Hayes' rescue, the world felt strangely fragile, as though every movement belonged to someone learning to live again. The hospital bed beneath him was soft, in a way that almost felt unreal, a stark contrast to the unforgiving ground that had cradled him in the wilderness. Doctors came and went, assessing his injuries, cleaning his wounds, adjusting his splint, and offering reassurances that he was healing well. Yet the true healing happened not in his bones, but in the quiet spaces of his thoughts. He replayed every moment in the forest, the fall, the hunger, the mushrooms that kept him alive, the cold nights, the disappearance of certainty, and the unexpected arrival of hope. As he lay beneath white fluorescent lights, he realized just how close he had come to vanishing without a trace, swallowed by the indifferent expanse of nature. And yet, through it all, something unseen had guided him step by trembling step. When Olivia entered the hospital room for the first time, her face streaked with tears of both fear and relief, Ethan could not speak. His voice broke before a single word could form, and she rushed to his side, folding into him with trembling hands. The weight of her embrace anchored him more deeply than any rescue rope could have. It reminded him that survival was not just about living another day, but about returning to the people who give meaning to those days. As she held him, Ethan understood that his journey had not merely been a fight against the elements, but a confrontation with the parts of himself he had long ignored. His impatience, his self-reliance to the point of stubbornness, his reluctance to acknowledge his own fragility. In the forest, he had been stripped down to his simplest truths, and now, in this room, he felt the fullness of what had been preserved. A life intertwined with love. A future still unfolding before him. Weeks later, as Ethan stood outside the hospital on crutches, watching the late afternoon sun dip behind the mountains, He breathed in the world as though it were new terrain. Every sound, the distant traffic, the soft hum of conversation, even the wind brushing past, felt like a reminder that life was no longer something to take for granted. The wilderness had tested him, broken him, fed him, and ultimately returned him, reshaped and renewed. He understood now that survival was never meant to be a solitary achievement. It was an invitation to gratitude, to humility, and to a deeper kind of courage. Ethan Hayes walked forward slowly, knowing that he had been given a second chance, not only to live, but to live with purpose, with reverence, and with a heart that remembered the forest's lessons. And as the fading light touched his face, he whispered a quiet thank you, honoring the journey that had changed him forever.